Good evening. I'm Selwyn Collins, your host of CWS Conversations with Selwyn. Thank you for joining us. And those of you who are joining us for the first time, a very special thank you. Every week, I come on here with someone, hoping that we will hear an interesting story, and it has never failed because I believe that each of us has a story to tell. And what to me is most important about a story is not just the successes, but the challenges and how the person has overcome them. I hope that by the end of each conversation, someone out there, especially a youth, learns something, perhaps recognize a similar challenge, and is able to step beyond their limitations and challenge and move forward. What I also hope from these conversations is that they are not only enlightening, but they are also transformative. For those of you who are now tuning in for the first time, what we do here is have conversations with people about their journeys. How are they using their gifts and talents to help others? How are they making positive contributions to humanity? So I am always looking for someone who is doing something extraordinary or something extraordinarily well. It doesn't have to be someone who is extremely academically qualified, but someone that has a story and is willing to tell it. Tonight we have a packed show, so I will shorten my monologue. And when I return, I'll introduce you to my brother, Errol Cockfield. So let's take a break. We are back. Good evening once again. I'm Selwyn Collins, your host of CWS Conversations with Selwyn. The gentleman next to me is Mr. Errol Cockfield, my good friend and brother. Errol, good evening.
How you doing, Selwyn? Great to be with you, and it's great to be on this show. I really enjoy the work, so good to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. I just want to go into your bio a little bit, and then, we could get started. Errol Cockfield is a senior vice president at Edelman, the world's largest public relations agency, where advises he advises companies on crisis management. Cockfield specializes in developing strategic communications plans to mitigate risk, public affairs campaigns, and proactive messaging to position brands and strengthen reputations. Cockfield has successfully steered clients through a range of crises related to product and food recalls, serious reputational damage, product launches, impending regulatory changes, and controversial advertising and marketing campaigns. Cockfield also specializes in providing reputation management counsel to universities. A veteran of New York's political and journalism circles, Cockfield served as press secretary to New York Governor Eliot Spitzer and his successor David Paterson during one of the most tumultuous political and fiscal crises in the state's history. He was also chief of staff and communications director to the leader of the New York State Senate, and led communications for the state's chief economic developing agency as it oversaw the rebuilding of the World Trade Center site and other major development initiatives. Cockfield spent a dozen years in journalism as a reporter for the Los Angeles Times, Newsday, and Connecticut's Hartford Courant, where his primary coverage areas were politics, economic development, and real estate. He's a graduate of Stony Brook University, my brother. I'm so happy to have you here finally.
It's good to be here. We finally got together, didn't we?
Finally. I want to go right into it. You were born in Guyana and lived somewhat in Trinidad. What was it like growing up in Guyana and Trinidad?
Well, I think I grew up in Guyana and Trinidad until I was 10, and and I've been in the States ever since then. But I have to say the experience, the rural experience of Guyana compared to the hustle and bustle of New York City is quite a contrast. But I think it grounds you. You know, I spent my early childhood in a village called Buxton on the east coast of Guyana, and you know, it's very rural. You know, the time I was growing up, the road I grew up on, it wasn't paved with asphalt yet. You know what I mean? So, you know, we had, you know, main pipes in the village. You'd run and get water and fetch a bucket of water over to granny's asking you to get a bucket of water. You know, that kind of thing. Not extensive lighting in certain areas. So that's 1980s Guyana, right?
Right.
So to then come to the States, you know, as a kid, tall buildings, subway system, bus system, you know, it's quite a contrast, and I think it kind of frames your thinking, understanding, okay, this is where I've come from, these are the possibilities in front of me.
So, what have you learned from those two cultures that still resonate with you today?
You know, what's fascinating to me coming from a developing country is, in spite of all the struggles that people have in a developing country, in a country like Guyana, is how happy people are, how anchored they are in the bonds of family and friendship, and even in an environment that is so tough. But in the United States or in the more developed world, you know, certainly people are anchored in those bonds as well, but you know, it's not fetching water from a main pipe in the village, right? You know, but the contrast to me, it's sort of it's around perspective. It's like, you know, when you have varying experiences around just the most basics of daily life, right? It kind of frames how you think about what really makes you happy, what should make you happy. And that for me has always been the connections I have with friends, family.
Well, give us a glimpse into the. Well, you left there when you were 10, right?
Yeah.
All right. Let me switch the age. Give me a glimpse into the 9-year-old Errol,
Yeah.
and then later the 18 years old Errol.
Well, I think in my formative years, when I realized when I left Guyana, lived in Trinidad, briefly came to the States, and was exposed to all of the opportunities of the United States, educational opportunities, I realized that this was something I had to soak up. I was very aware of the difference and how dramatic the difference was. And I knew my parents had struggled very hard to get to the States, and I felt almost like I had a contract with them in my teen years when I was in middle school and high school and then starting college. I felt like I had to keep my part of the bargain to them, that this was the driving force for why they came to the States, and I needed to essentially succeed to complete that bargain. So that's sort of where I was, you know, 18 years old. I was in the middle of college. You know, I started college at 16. I was 18. I was, you know, starting my junior year. And, you know, I was very driven to get out of school, get a job. My focus was to create a narrative so that when I graduated from school, I was going to, you know, launch myself into a good career.
So what would you say is your fondest memories of your parents? Memory of your parents? As a child.
As a child,
Yeah.
the things I appreciate most about my parents I think the level of inquisitiveness that I was taught in my household, books around my dad. I mean, he's got books from when he was in school in Guyana still in his personal library today.
Wow.
So I was always surrounded by books, periodicals, magazines. My mother, one of the great things about my mother, she always, like, we would speak, you know, broken English in our household, but she was always clear on, there's one way you talk in terms of the house, and there's another way you talk in terms of what you're putting out there in school and professionally. So she was always big on grammar and proper speech.
Talking
And then
of-
and
yeah.
then my parents, I think when I was coming up, they always took us on the weekends. There were lots of trips to the zoo, to museums, excursions. They have always had this inquisitiveness and this active spirit that is part of me today.
And talking about language
Yeah.
and the way we communicate.
Which is certainly like something I want to be a theme for our conversation
Yes,
today.
yes.
Yeah, yeah.
For the young people that are listening in tonight, how important is that? I mean, if you must have 2 or 3 different way of speaking a particular language, and we can go there, Creole, Ebonics, or what, broken English, whatever you want to call it.
Right.
How important is that you're able to separate the two?
Yeah, I think it's very important. Now, I'm a communications professional. I think I've had 3 careers, kind of sub-careers within communications, as a journalist, as a government official, and now I work in public relations as an advisor to companies. So I've had those 3 careers. But as a thread through all of those careers has been my love for language and my capability around language, written, oral language, right? And my view is that no matter what business you're in, no matter what your professional story is, command of language is extremely important, and the ability to have a certain dexterity around language is really important. So the language that I grew up with a broken English that's Guyanese that I could switch into if I need to. But I also, when I was a kid and a teen, I realized that there was a kind of a commonly spoken English in the United States that I needed to really have a strong grasp of. So I devoured books. I wrote poetry. I really paid strong attention to current events, newscasts, those kinds of things. And I tried to absorb as much of that as I could so that I had a certain level of fluency. Now, people might think it's interesting to talk about fluency in English, but there is fluency in English. They think about fluency in terms of a second language and a third language. But you can have levels of fluency within your own language that dictate your ability to write something as simple as an email or a text message to something as extensive as a term paper or a thesis or a book. And really understanding how that ability empowers you over time through the entire narrative of your life, no matter what you do professionally, is really, really important, I think.
As a senior vice president at Edelman, right?
Yeah.
Edelman, right?
Edelman's in the United States.
How did you get started there?
Now, Edelman recruited me after I worked in government. I worked in government. I worked for the Spitzer administration and Patterson administration, 2 governors in New York. I worked for a couple of state agencies, chiefly on economic development. And when Edelman was looking for someone in New York to lead their crisis team, now Edelman, they came to me. Now Edelman is the largest PR firm in the world. It has about 5,000 people globally and 67 different offices around the world. We just opened our first office in Africa, for instance, in Johannesburg. In New York, in the New York office, which is the largest office, I am the day-to-day lead on what's called crisis and issues management. And they recruited me into that role largely because of my background in government, working through some very tense times in New York, and because of also my ability, my background as a journalist. So what I do is for large companies and organizations and universities is when they have media issue, things that could become a media issue or have become a media issue, I lead a team of folks who we advise them and help them prepare to deal with those issues. So for instance, Penn State has been a client of mine, General Electric is a client of mine, companies like that.
What can you tell us about public relations that the average layperson will probably never know or never be exposed to?
Yeah, I think what might surprise a lot of people is that when you read the newspaper, or you're watching a television show and you see a representative from a company or an organization, oftentimes there's a lot of coaching that goes into that, way more than you think. Or when you see a company respond to a crisis and you see a statement in the newspaper, a statement on television, often those things are drafted and written months in advance, and that that might surprise a lot of people. But one of the things that we do, that my team does, is we help companies think about all of the permutations of things that they could face, weather-related, malfeasance, product recalls, food recalls, these types of things. And we actually help them develop strategies and language a year in advance, 2 years in advance, so that when the issue actually happens, you're drawing from an archive of things that are already prepared. And what that does is it in the speed of the moment, in an age where people are tweeting by the second and responding to things in real time, it brings a certain speed and efficiency to how you respond. I'll give you an example. Today, if a plane crashes and let's say, no one is, really hurt, and you have a plane sitting on a tarmac with a broken wing in 2013 headed into 2014, what's the difference today between 20 years ago? The difference is you have people sitting on that plane who are able to tweet their experience, Facebook their experience, text their friends. So if you're a brand, if you're an airline, you actually have people communicating about their negative experience in real time, right? Previously, it might take several hours for news to get out, or as much of a day for news to get out. So that allowed you more time to prepare and control things, right? But now, it's really important for you to have those things prepared, because they're sending photos and they're sending tweets in real time. So we help companies manage those situations.
So you preempt.
Well, we try to give them the tools so that the blow is a softer blow, not a sudden blow. Or, we like to say that crises can often be opportunities.
Right.
Because how they comport themselves in a crisis says a lot about their ideals, about their value system, what they say, what they communicate about who they are, how quickly they respond, how often they respond, right? So if you handle a crisis badly, it can say a lot about who you are and dictate how people deal with you in a year, 2 years, 5 years, or, and that can be a negative experience, or it can be a very, very positive experience if you handle it well.
So this could cost you dearly if you don't.
Yeah, like a prominent example is how BP handled the oil spill in the Gulf. I think it's commonly thought that they handled the first many months of that badly. But since then, you may have noticed they're trying to do ad campaigns. They're getting their workers out there talking about what BP is doing for the Gulf, about them being a community partner. Some of the messaging that some might argue they could have had in the beginning, they're really working hard to strike that kind of tone now.
So you deal with personal crises too?
Well, we more so represent companies. We don't really represent individuals. You'll find a smaller, more boutique shop might work with a celebrity, for instance. We don't work with celebrities. We work with multinational corporations, universities, that kind of scale.
Do you have a favorite quote about crisis?
Favorite? I actually like the quote that every crisis is an opportunity.
It's an opportunity.
I like that. I like that as a guiding principle for crises. And I think, we talk about crises in the context of companies a lot. But personally, for each of us, we have crises in our lives.
Right.
All the time. We have crises with family. We have crises professionally. And I think it's a good guiding principle to have for how we deal with tension, because invariably you deal with tension in the most, the most delicate of relationships in your life, right? And I think it's a good perspective to have, to kind of see tension as an opportunity to reinforce your values individually.
Hypothetical. I'm the CEO of a mid-sized company. One of our vice presidents offended a rich and influential client that we cannot afford to lose. The incident has gotten negative attention in the media. What advice can you give us to contain or to repair the damage?
Well, I would say in a situation like that, you first have to, the first thing you've got to do that we advise people to do is assess the scale of the attention something is getting. And there are a lot of ways to do that. We have all kinds of tools that allow us to measure things down to the tweet, down to the Facebook post. So we can tell you how many people have likely read a New York Times story, how many people have sent tweets about an issue. And what we try to advise companies is, once you assess the level of conversation, the response should be based on the scale. So if nobody's really talking about something externally, or it's a very low level of conversation, it's probably likely that you'd be able to deal with that internally, right? If it's a large level of conversation, water cooler talk, the layman is, talking about it, then you're gonna need to probably put out, depending on what this vice president has said, you may need to put out a statement saying what this person has done doesn't meet with our culture, our values, our ethics, to send a signal to other clients that this is not something we're gonna condone.
What kind of businesses or should all have a crisis management plan?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we're seeing, and I think it's comforting to see for consumers, right? I think you want to know that a business is thinking about how to manage a crisis, that it's not slap and dash, right? But what we're seeing more and more is companies coming to us, ahead of time and saying, although things are quiet, we want to be prepared, because what they're seeing is they're seeing the companies that are handling things badly in real time, and they're saying, we don't want to be those guys. So they're coming to folks like Edelman and our peers and saying, we want to prepare more and more ahead of time. So we then spend, time visiting with representatives of companies, doing a lot of discovery and research, finding out where their areas of vulnerability are, and helping them essentially beef up for when those things happen.
Talking about, I want to talk a bit about marketing and positioning. What are rappers or artists, especially rappers, what are they doing right these days?
What are they doing right? I think I think in the entertainment industry, especially in the music business, it's not a question of right and wrong. It's a question of reach, right? So for them, it's not a morality question. So your question is, what are they doing? I think if we're asking a question about reach, they're doing a great job in terms of reach for their business, right? Yes. They are, what they're doing, and it's raising a lot of questions, is they're manufacturing controversy to draw attention to themselves and then increase sales. So one really, really vivid example recently was when Miley Cyrus decided that she was going to do a dance called twerking on, I think it was a prominent award show. I think it may have been can't remember if it was MTV or VH, I think it may have been MTV Music Awards. So she did this dance, which is really kind of born in the African American community, sexually flirtatious dance. And You know, she's a young white singer, and she's on stage and she's doing this dance, and it drew a ton of attention. The video of it went viral, and then later that week she issued a song that talked about twerking. So then the song got
Yes.
got a lot of sales.
So-
So I mean, in a lot of ways, I mean, I don't think it's any coincidence that she was twerking on stage and then she was, she issued a song about twerking.
Is that good marketing?
I mean, we
Or that's
we can
subjective?
debate it. I think it is subjective. But certainly for her brand,
Right.
she has to think as a young artist about what does this mean for my brand. I'm 19, 20 years old now. What's it going to mean for my brand when I'm 30 or 35 if I'm still doing this, am I going to be able to transform myself to an older audience, a different audience, or not? So I think that's a lot of that's not the kind of thing that she's thinking about now, but it's the kind of thing she's going to have to think about.
Talking about reach, and so who comes to mind? One of your favorite artists. I don't know if he still is Jay-Z. What are your thoughts on the way his group is handling the Barney's controversy?
I think it is very difficult for when you are an artist and you have a partnership with a brand, right? That there may be legal issues at play, right, related to contracts you've signed, partnerships over time, right? And then when something happens that grabs the attention of your audience, a big part of your audience, and it elicits strong emotion, you've got to then make a calculation about this business partnership that's just starting versus the long-term enduring relationship that you have with your fan base, and how and you've got to really give a lot of thought to how you manage that. In Jay-Z's case, I think he's worked very hard to preserve that relationship with Barney's.
With Barney's, okay.
Yeah.
What can be improved in the way the advocates of the Affordable Care Act inform that it is helpful to many? Is or was there a framing issue?
I think even the White House would agree that they didn't do, and they've said this publicly, it's not a debate, that they could have done a better job framing the issue, telling people, like, this is happening, this is coming online, you'll be able to take advantage of it. I think the dysfunctions of the website have been pretty well publicized, but my long-term thinking on this is that if people have a need and there's availability and a will, that people are going to find a way to get something that they really, really need. Through the haze and the smoke of this kind of early stage of the launch of this thing, there may be people who may not engage, but as things settle down and people begin to really understand on a broad level what's available and how it will impact their lives, their children's lives, the lives of aging seniors, you're going to find more and more people flocking to the use of that healthcare site and enrolling. I believe that.
In September 2007, you were named one of City Hall's 40 under 40 for being a young, influential member of New York politics. What do you believe it is in your journalism and political journey that earned you such recognition?
Well, one thing I'll say is, like, I feel very blessed about my journey. One thing I always think that I'm blessed in the sense that, like, of where I came from versus where I am. I think it's when I was, in Guyana, as a little boy, I could never conceive of being in the United States, working for two governors, visiting the White House, going on to work for the largest PR agency in the world, and interacting with CEOs and presidents of universities and advising individuals at that level on how to deal with communications and media issues. But one thing, it's as simple as this. One thing led to another. It's as simple as that. It's funny. I tell people, like, a lot of times people say one of the things in life is just showing up and doing what you need to do, but also being in the right place at the right time, but also preparing yourself for when opportunity is there. You're able to respond. So I worked for 3 newspapers. I covered politics. Covering politics led to politicians paying attention to me. Politicians then hired me. I worked in politics as a government official. Working as a government official then led to people in private industry paying attention to me and wanting to recruit me to advise people in private industry. But that was all driven by, I think, one of the things that I'm thankful for is I've always had a gift for words and the use of words. So from the time I was in middle school writing poetry, then led to me writing for my school newspaper, then me being an editor of the college student newspaper, to then, me getting a job at 3 newspapers coming out of school, to then, working for governors as a press secretary, to then advising people on communications. Now, the thread through all of that is just a guy who read a lot, wrote a lot, and talks a lot. I hope not too much, but you know what I mean? But practicing the precision and the force of communication. And like I said, I am biased in that I work in communication, but if you're an engineer, a fashion designer, a makeup artist, it doesn't matter what your story is. If you're going to transform your life as it relates to your professional journey, you've got to know how to talk to people. And I think, what's interesting in communities of color, especially the African American community, one of the things we struggle with is literacy, right? But I think we think of literacy as written. Okay? Literacy is, it's spoken and written. And I think what's important about that is that how you communicate frames one chapter of it after another in your life. Because when you have the power of communication, people then talk about their interactions with you to other people, right? And that then leads to opportunities, right? So something as simple as an email communicates a story about you. Something as simple as a Facebook post communicates a story about you. And I think one of the things I caution young people today is, they go on Twitter, they go on Instagram, they go on Facebook, and they communicate a lot. But even those things establish a digital signature about who you are and how you communicate. And people, they make judgments in these very, very brief snapshots, right? And you've got to think, like, personal is often connected to professional and perception, right?
Why you think this is so today? Is it because life, information is moving at such a fast pace that people don't have the time to really dissect, a person's biography and journey and try to figure out who they are? They just take these snapshots, these digital snapshots.
Well, I think what's going on is we're in a time now where people are able to get a lot of information about individuals, way more than they did before. So one of the things that people do almost immediately when they meet people is they Google them, right? So they get a sense of, and a lot of people don't put protections on their digital platforms. So especially young people, I find, do not put a lot of protections on their digital platforms, right? So, but here's the thing. If you're a 16-year-old that's having a certain kind of conversation on Twitter and Facebook, and then you're the 22-year-old trying to get a job, and you haven't put in the proper protections, then, people may not be able to reconcile what you were saying at 16 versus what you're trying to present at 22. And that's really important. It used to be your personal life and your professional presentation were very much separated. But that line has become very much blurred today.
I'm going to ask you a quick question. Is there, it's kind of a jovial question, is there a building, is there a government institution you do not have access to in New York State, sir?
Do not have access to?
Yeah.
You mean, or individuals that do not have access to?
Well,
you mean branches of government?
Yes, exactly.
Probably the judiciary. As far as the others, I know somebody who knows somebody. Yeah.
In the chat room, Karen G said, could not agree more. The art of knowing how to talk to people, very strong. And Patrick said, good evening to you and your guests. Errol, let's take a quick break.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
You're the God that I serve.
God that I serve.
I'll put no one else before you. Never will I doubt you, no. You're the God that I serve.
God that I serve.
See, even though the roads get rocky and the way seems sticky sometimes, yeah.
We are back with Mr. Errol Cockfield. Errol, as an experienced journalist.
Yeah. Now former journalist, but by it's my training set, so I always consider myself a journalist. It's like Jesus was a carpenter who went on to be a priest.
Right, okay.
You know what I mean?
As a journalist.
Once a journalist, always a journalist.
What are your thoughts on our last mayoral elections? And did you expect the mayor-elect Bill Blasio to win?
I don't even think his own team expected him to win. And I mean, and I think they would even say that. I think there was a dramatic shift in that race near the end that surprised a lot of people. Mm-hmm. But I think they're to be congratulated for, taking advantage of those shifts and putting forward a really compelling message that really excited New Yorkers.
Okay.
Because I think they really spoke to, I think de Blasio has really spoken to this sense that there's a set of people who are doing well in New York, mm-hmm. and there's a set of people who are not doing so well. And the city, has not really been able to reconcile that divide. Mm. And I think the great hope is that he'll be able to bridge that.
I was going to ask you, what, in your opinion, can New Yorkers expect from this new administration? That's one.
I think the guiding principle for de Blasio is in everything that he does, he's going to be looking for ways to improve the quality of life of low-income poor and low-income New Yorkers. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think at bottom, and this is very much kind of wired into who he is, he's going to be looking for ways for the person who is really struggling to take care of their family and earning a wage that's right on the edge. Mm-hmm. How do you get them training to improve their station in life, and then how does that trickle down to their kids? Mm-hmm. And one of the things I think you're going to see the strongest focus on, employment access is going to be like a huge focus, and kind of rising tide lifts all boats. That's going to be, I think, a guiding principle. But he's going to put a lot of emphasis into early childhood education. Mm-hmm. All the studies show that the best predictor for how well a child will do over the long term, throughout life, is the kind of education they get in the early years. I mean, younger than 10. Okay. So what he's talked about doing is raising a lot of money to expand early childhood education in the city.
Are you optimistic about his efforts?
I'm very optimistic. I think he's coming in with a very, very strong mandate. And I think he is someone who already has pretty vast relationships in government. He worked for the Clintons. He worked for David Dinkins. He's got a relationship with the governor. And I think he's going to bring those relationships to bear.
Can you move this mic a little bit?
Oh, yeah, sure.
No,
Yeah.
towards you. Right?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Sorry about that.
In the chat room, Wayne said, couldn't agree more about the importance of communication. Given how young people communicate now, is there any advice he could give them on how to acquire such skills that they would need in business?
Yeah, one of the things that I tell young people, and I talk to a lot of young people all the time, I mentor a lot of young people, is I think one of the things that I see less of that disturbs me is people should be consuming news every day. When you get up, you should be like reading publications, you should be watching the news, you should be listening to what's going on, reading what's going on, because consuming that information and reading how people write about it and hearing how people discuss it is actually going to inform how you discuss and how you write. The best way that I've found to improve your literacy, your personal literacy, is through consumption and then repetition. So the books you read, the magazines you read, the newspapers you read, and a lot of these things are online now, but it makes no difference whether you're reading a book on your Kindle or you're reading it. You're still consuming, right? And what happens is your brain absorbs all of that. It absorbs how people say things. One of the things about my own story, as a journalist, I'm a writer. But I couldn't tell you about the mechanics of language. I just know what is appropriate and right and what isn't. And the way I learned that was by consuming a lot of books, magazines. So I can instinctively tell you what's right and wrong.
Yes. Yeah.
But as far as like English, mechanics, I know subject verb agreement. The other stuff I couldn't tell you about.
Gerard and all his friends, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
Some are calling our borough New Brooklyn.
Yeah.
Right.
And I live in Brooklyn.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I lived here.
Admittedly, Brooklyn is changing. Its demographics, its landscape and skyline, perhaps even its economics. Should we be celebrating or concerned? And what are your thoughts?
Well, I think there's reason for celebration and there's reason for concern. But I think there's reason for concern because it's getting much more expensive to live here, and the traditional communities that have been here have been forced to move and look at other options. And that's always a sad development when you see that kind of demographic change, and long timers have to consider other options when you know how much they love Brooklyn, right? And we should be thinking about ways and implementing ways to make housing more accessible and to bring some controls to the rise in the cost of housing and the rise in the cost of living generally, right? But I think there's also reason to be optimistic about where Brooklyn is headed, because a lot of neighborhoods that people didn't want to spend a lot of time in 20 years ago, they're boutiques opening up and restaurants and what have you, but it's hard to strike that balance between the optimism about that kind of growth and this departure that you see.
What was the trigger that led you into journalism? When did it?
It's interesting because I wanted to do medicine for a long time, but then I realized that I spent most of my time writing and devouring news. And, when I got into my freshman year in college, I had like a serious discussion with myself. If I'm spending all this time writing and I'm just, hungry about news all of the time, then maybe I could pair these two things. So I started doing work for, at Stony Brook University out on Long Island at the time. There were 4 newspapers on campus, and I started doing work for 2 of them. And like I said, one thing led to another. That led to internships and job opportunities. But it started with me essentially. If my parents left a magazine on the coffee table, I read it cover to cover.
What I'm hearing, the connective thread or the common thread I'm hearing here tonight is the one thing led to another is is taking advantage of opportunities and making that connection.
Yeah.
And I like that, especially for young people that are listening tonight.
Yeah.
Is that
yeah. And one of the things that concerns me is with young people, African Americans, and I definitely want to kind of bring that lens into the conversation as
Sure.
well as someone who's black. I get concerned about how much we're promoting a constant engagement around education in our homes, with our young people, because it's a different time and people are engaged in different things, and like I mentioned, my dad has books from the time that he was a kid. I grew up in a home with books around me. Now we grew up with people with Kindles around them or iPads around them, and some, not as many books, but it's a different. I think today there's a different recipe of engagement with a child than there was before, and we have to be aware of that, and we have to pay more attention to how kids are learning. Then I think parents have to do that and mentors have to do that in different ways than they did before, just to ensure that level of engagement is still happening.
It's interesting you said that. Delphine, who you went to school with, was here last night, and she was talking about the same thing.
Yeah.
That the education system tests people deficiencies or deficits more than their strengths, and people have different ways of learning.
Yeah, that's important.
No, that's very important. Karen G said, preach about reading. However, would you not say having engaging conversations with groups and people outside your comfort zone, outside your comfort, is a huge plus as well? Would you say join groups like Toastmasters, etc.?
Yeah, I agree with Karen wholeheartedly on that. I think one of the things that worries me about social media is that people are using social media in lieu of other kinds of interaction. So, and I think groups like Toastmasters are really, really important, or things as basic as the church, the church you attend, or the community center, and the ability to interact with not only other young people but people of all ages, rather than these sort of one-off interactions that happen online where it sort of feels sometimes like people are talking at each other, not having a conversation. And the thing that's so important about conversation and learning the art of conversation at an early age is that it empowers you to talk to whomever, whenever, so that when you get into the professional world, you're not intimidated. One of the things that concerns me in the professional world is when you come across people and you're trying to engage and their eyes are dropping.
Yes.
Because they haven't practiced, and in some cases they haven't been given the tools to practice.
Your intellectual curiosity. When did this insatiable appetite for knowledge actually begin? When were you aware of it? As a child?
Yeah, I think as a child, sort of higher single digits, I'd say I became aware of it. But like I said, I had the good fortune of parents who were intellectually curious, who always had discussions about current events, about politics. They were always bringing in the conversation happening outside the home into the home, and that made me more curious. And then just having a lot of books and periodicals around.
Karen G said in the chat room, you are certainly touching some core issues like education and communication. I want to touch a bit on your timeline. While president of New York Association of Black Journalists, what was your vision for the organization, and were you able to accomplish your vision during your tenure?
Yeah, around the time of, actually it was not too long after 9/11, I became president of an organization called the New York Association of Black Journalists, which is one of the largest, if not the largest chapter of a national umbrella group called the National Association of Black Journalists. So it's an affinity group for journalists, work in newspapers, television stations, journalists of black journalists. And at the time, the organization had undergone some leadership strain, and I had done some volunteer work for it. I'd put together mentor programs for high schoolers and that sort of thing, and then I was asked at this time to take on the presidency and took over. And my goal really was just to expand the profile of the organization at the time, and it was on a volunteer basis. I worked at Newsday as a reporter at the time, but I think what was great about it was, I was able to expand the profile of this organization and expand its membership, and we did things with the new mayor at the time, Bloomberg, and we had great events, and we became part of the conversation about diversity in newsrooms. But I think what was also good for me personally at the time was that it taught me some leadership skills, additional leadership skills. And I think extracurricular work is really important at any level of your life, because what it does is it's a training ground for professional life. So you can make mistakes volunteering at the church or the community center, right? That it's good to make mistakes there because they won't kick you out, right? But if you make a mistake in the professional environment, they might kick you out. So the great thing about that was I learned in that role that if I could motivate people who aren't getting paid, I could probably manage and motivate people who are getting paid.
Yes.
So I always encourage people to have a diverse list of activities that they're involved in, and community is central to that, I think.
Well, what are you happy about in this current media landscape?
What am I happy about? I'm actually happy about access, meaning when I wake up in the morning, I can grab my phone and typically I'll just give you a sense of my routine at 6 o'clock in the morning. So I'll grab my phone, and I'll usually spend the first 30 minutes of the day reading the top headlines, the top stories in the New York Times, the New York Post, the Daily News, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today. There's a site called Politico that I like that follows the happenings politically in Washington, D.C. I scan all of those, like, kind of in bed, sitting up in bed, just reading them. I read the top stories, and then I read those in more detail when I get on the train, and then I read them in a little more detail when I get to my office. But what I like about the ability to read all those things on the phone is, like, I don't need the physical paper anymore, right? And some people have bemoaned that, but I haven't really bemoaned that. I mean, I think it's a great transformation to see. I just think that we have to adapt to meet that transformation. I heard the CEO of Amazon gave an interview recently, and he talked about how Amazon is being criticized because small, independent sellers are worried about this behemoth Amazon, and the ability of people to go online and buy all these things on Amazon and have them shipped to their homes. And he's saying, look, we're meeting the future here. You know what I'm saying? And people can't really bemoan their inability to catch up to the future. I think that's real.
Do you believe journalism appeals or is appealing to the black youth, and enough of them entering the field?
I think that's been a real concern for a long time. The numbers have been starkly low, especially among black men. I haven't seen the most recent numbers, but I know that that's an ongoing struggle. I think one of the things that I worry about with young black kids is this sort of disassociation with intellectualism. And I think we can debate whether that's reality or not. I think it's a reality. I think that disassociation with intellectualism is driving people to romanticize about certain careers when they should be sort of thinking pragmatically about careers they can really get into. That's not to say you can't become a rapper or a ball player. You can set your mind to it, and you can. But a lot of people don't reach that, and it's actually an easier course to kind of set a task that you're going to become an engineer, or you're going to become a healthcare specialist, or whatever it is. Set your mind to that and see it through, rather than romanticizing about something that may really be much more elusive.
Karen G in the chat room said, can you please emphasize the art of speaking well is not about speaking white? I hear us being labeled this way, and I find it quite ignorant.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, that's something I grappled with when I got to the States, because I had an accent from the Caribbean, so I had American kids making fun of me. It's funny because we moved from Guyana to Trinidad. I had Trinidadian kids making fun of my Guyanese accent. I then moved from Trinidad to the U.S. and I had American kids making fun of a combination of both accents. So I've struggled with that, but I think it goes back to my point about fluency and about the command of language you need to have in the moment. And that's not about speaking white. I mean, I can, to keep it real for a second, you can put on airs and try to sound black. You can try to sound white. But look, at the end of the day, it's about, for the professional setting, it's about proper English that's going to get you where you need to go.
I agree.
Right? And if you're going to be putting on airs, people see through that, right? So that's inauthentic. It's about being your authentic self, but being correct.
What were some of your duties as Chief of Staff and Communications Director to the leader of the New York State?
Yeah, for a period of time, I worked in the New York State Senate, and I worked in a role that was a sort of hybrid role where I worked for all of the Democrats in the New York State Senate. I worked for the leader, but all the Democrats together form what's called a caucus. And I essentially helped develop the policy platforms for that group. And I helped develop strategies to articulate that in the press and to external stakeholders like unions, advocacy groups in certain areas, and I helped, with sort of long-term strategic planning for that.
Talking about communication, I'm just curious. These various entities, communicating with them, communicating those policies, they require us.
You mean, I'm talking newspaper. It could be newspapers. It could be the Healthcare Association of New York State,
And that requires a certain kind of language, a certain kind of vocabulary, I would say.
Well,
or nuance, if.
Well, it's understanding. I mean, I think the first rule of communication is who's your audience, right? So if President Obama sits down with Benjamin Netanyahu, who's the president of Israel, that's a different audience than sitting down with the president of Afghanistan. It's a different audience, right? Versus sitting down with the victims of gun violence or healthcare insurers, right? So before, and this goes back to, I think a big part of my message today is, even in your personal life, you've got to think about who your audience is. And in your professional life, you've got to think about your audience. But we actually sometimes think that in our personal lives, we turn that off. We don't have to think strategically about audience and how we communicate in our personal lives, right? But for me, so much of it is intertwined, because when you think about it in every aspect of your life, it then becomes second nature. It becomes a reflex. Like, I'm having a conversation with Selwyn Collins. Who is Selwyn Collins? Who's his audience? What is Selwyn's story? How is Selwyn's story similar to mine? What's the story of Selwyn's audience, right? What am I going to talk about today that actually resonates with that audience in a real way? If I start talking about things that your audience doesn't care about, they're going to tune out, right? So even if you're talking to a family member or a friend or an associate you've just been introduced to, if you're not actually learning about who that person is and speaking to what they want to hear about, then they're not going to want to listen to you. And some people actually have do you have any friends and associates who seem like they're talking but they don't have a sense of who you are, or like they're just never listening? There are a lot of people guilty of that. even CEOs of companies.
Talking about Brooklyn and all these changes that are taking place, what is this Brooklyn energy that we feel, that so many people talk about, so many people are coming here to get a sip of it? Can it be described?
What's interesting? I think a lot about what you just said, right? About the changing demographics of places like Brooklyn and Harlem, that have almost been like these petri dishes for a lot of noted celebrities, politicians, movers and shakers, right? It seems to me that there's something about a certain kind of struggle that comes out of the toughness of a place like Brooklyn, of a place like Harlem in a certain day, right? That actually, gave us people, the Adam Clayton Powells and the Michael, Jordans. He was only in Brooklyn for a little bit, but we'll claim him too. Right. But I think one of the things I wonder about the transformation of Brooklyn is whether or not that toughness that comes out of this gritty Brooklyn experience, as Brooklyn becomes less gritty, are we gonna have that same kind of energy that is the petri dish for success that we've seen?
I'm thinking we would call it Times Square. Some describe it today as
well, that's a whole different story, because Times Square was a seedy mess. I'm talking about the Brooklyn of graffiti, the Brooklyn of hip hop when it was growing, with arts and culture, just taking over a city, right? And working and lower middle class families fighting to survive, provide for their kids, and what that sort of struggle creates, right?
The art, the creativity.
There's something about being rooted in that kind of struggle for the American dream that produces really, really successful people, right? So it's the thing that parents debate, right? Parents debate, do they want to give their kids everything, or do they want them to struggle a little bit? So when a kid turns 16, are they going to give them a car, or are they going to give them a Metro card?
Yes.
Right? Because some parents think Metro card might, that might build a little more toughness and character, right? It seemed to me that Brooklyn, for a long time, because of that middle and working class blue collar story generated a lot of really, really special and transformative success stories. I mean, I feel like I'm part of that, but I don't know that the new Brooklyn is going to be that.
We don't know.
I don't know. I'm waiting to see. I'm curious.
Maybe that's a good thing.
Yeah.
You know, Karen G said the vibe, energy, go-getter attitude. I think it will still be here, but not in the old neighborhoods as it existed.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to lean in that direction.
Social media, Errol.
Yeah.
Social media, and its various strands. You know.
That's definitely a good word for it.
Yes,
it's fluid in that way, right?
It's very strands seem tightly woven into our ethos. But how would you say it has influenced our behavior?
Well, I think, I don't think it's a different behavior. I just think it's a more public behavior. Meaning, I like to think of social media as the town square, the meeting point, right? So every village has one, every town has.
Yes.
It's the place where people go and they run into each other, and a couple people might slip off to the side and whisper. That means they're direct messaging each other. And then you have the people who are just loudly talking for everyone to hear. That means they're making it all public. And their opinions of everyone are public. And then you have the people who are sort of on the side of the square, leaning out of windows and listening. They're just a fly on the wall, and every now and again they might shout something from their window, So, look, I think our attitudes haven't changed. How we feel, how we deal with issues, events, it hasn't changed. It's a different platform for that, And I think if anything, it's like a bullhorn, or it's like these tools that give you a louder voice or a wider reach, but it sort of still speaks to our idiosyncrasies as human beings.
I agree. I agree.
But I think we have to be very careful about that reach. I mean, that's one of the things that I worry about when, like I said, you're a teenager and you don't have the counsel of the years yet, and you're building a digital footprint, a signature over time, and these things are hard to delete and clean up, and then you're then heading into college and people are looking at what you said, and so I think people could use some lessons on the long-term impact of what they say. Now when the town square, when you said something in the town square, it went into air.
Right.
Or someone said, I think I heard Selwyn say that at the town square a month ago, but no one was recording.
Right.
It wasn't digitized.
You're alive.
And Selwyn could have said, a month later, actually, that's not quite what I said. You could raise doubt. Now, when something is digital and it's saved and archived, there is no doubt.
You think it has transformed journalism?
Yeah, for sure.
For sure.
I mean, I think a lot of people are still holding on to the days of the printed word, and I think there's always going to be a place for newspapers and actually hard copy books. But I think the production of those things is going to be much less. I think the advertising model is going to continue to gravitate towards online. But I think what I get concerned about is how do we archive our lives digitally? I mean, on a long-term basis, right? I mean, so we access this through computers, right? If you were ever mentioned in a newspaper, there was a profile on you, you might frame it, right? You might frame that newspaper. You might laminate it, right? Now people save things on their hard drives. They they put their photo albums on, they plug in the flash card and what if it just goes poof? What if it's the archive doesn't support it? It's all gone.
It's gone.
Right. That's one of the things,
that is a possibility.
I worry about,
That is a possibility.
Yeah. It's also one of the things we need to think about. It's supported by power. Okay, so what if there's a blackout? Or we don't have energy for a certain period of time? All those photos you took of your kid, if you didn't actually print them out, they're gone, right? If you can't access them, right? So when I think about events like Hurricane Sandy that crippled the metro system, right? What we are so reliant on, we're transforming to this digital life. But what if, there was a time when, okay, if there was a weather event, you could light a candle and still look at those baby pictures. But if they're digitized and you have no power, you can't look at them, right? So we need to think about how we individually balance relative to this transformation that's happening.
Let's take a quick break, Errol, and when we get back, let's do rapid fire. I got some questions to. Okay.
Na 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 na. Oh yeah. Oh. Jah, you're my strength. You're my strength.
We are back with Errol Cockfield. When are you most happy, Errol?
I'm most happy when I'm doing a lot of different things, but I'm probably most happy when I've written something that's fulfilling. Typically poetry. Yeah. Something that captures the moment. Something that captures, the sky I'm looking at. Something.
I saw a piece. I saw a piece the other day. You wrote about the clouds and so on and so forth. It's quite captivating. You accomplished a lot at a young age, yet so humble. What keeps you grounded?
I'm definitely. I think one of the things that keeps me grounded is understanding where I've come from relative to where I am today. And look, I have an immigrant story like yourself, like a lot of your viewers, and I think the immigrant story, especially when it's one of humble beginnings, helps you understand that. Humble then can be humble again.
Yeah. You're not kidding. You're not kidding.
So I really don't measure myself through things I've attained. I measure myself through relationships that I've built with people, and the ability to put a little food on my table and have some good interactions with the people I care about. But I understand, and I'm also a person of faith, but I understand that there are things, and I want my life to be measured by interaction, not attainment. So,
Los Angeles Times staff reporter, Hartford Courant and Newsday, major newspapers. What stood out about the various cultures at those organizations?
Well, I think newspapers are interesting as private entities because I think newspapers are still sort of like the last vestiges of the apprentice kind of, the apprentice learning at the foot of the master kind of culture, right? like the craftsman. The craftsman painter had his apprentice. The craftsman sculptor had his apprentice. I think newspapers are still these places where you come in, and they're these senior folks who've been doing it for a long time, and they're really kind of hardened, and they've covered everything from, you know, the weather disaster to the murder to the political scandal, and they're looking at you like, who's this kid? What does he or she know about anything, right? And there's a lot of trial and error as opposed to tutelage, right? And that's sort of always been the culture of newspapers. It's a tough world.
With all your successes and so on in the corporate environment, there are times when racism in its different flavors and textures will raise its head and so on. How have you generally dealt with that, if there was any?
Yeah, I mean, my personal view is that the best way to dismiss racism or to drive out racism is by making it clear through ability that there is nothing to be questioned about what you are able to do, right? So if you are a really, really good surgeon,
right,
people are going to want you to save their lives no matter what. They're going to say, that woman right there, she's a good surgeon. I want her to operate on me.
So be the best you can.
Right. So and that is not to say we shouldn't acknowledge racism. We have to acknowledge that racism exists, and we have to continue to do things to drive out racism. And I think government has a big role in that. And I think we collectively as a society have a big role in that. But I think for us personally, if you ask me if I work in an environment, how do I make sure that people who may harbor that in their hearts, how do I ensure that it doesn't affect me? I ensure that by my insurance policy is making sure I'm so good at what I do that I'm indispensable.
Sure.
So the way I operate in work environments is I want people to be concerned about what the landscape looks like if I'm not in that work environment. That means if I go on a long vacation, I want people to be concerned about, for that 2 weeks that I'm gone, how are we going to accomplish the things that we need? And that doesn't mean you can't be replaced,
right,
but you need to underscore your value to the point that if you're not there, people understand that it's a different environment when you're not.
Karen G said, isn't this why we have Google Drive, Dropbox, cloud computing? And I think we have to use some of the old media to keep the history and memories. Great points you made about storage, though. And then Jim asked, do you miss writing for newspapers?
I do. I do a lot of writing still, but it's writing in the public relations world is a different kind of writing than newspaper writing. But I still do a lot of writing, even though I'm pretty senior in my role, and I have people under me. I still take on a lot of tasks myself to keep things fresh, and I do a lot of personal writing, obviously. But newspaper writing, I do miss the ability to kind of go to an event, cover a story, talk to people, put the story together on deadline by 5 o'clock, talk to an editor. That process, there's something really special about that process. I have different deadlines now. They're not 5 o'clock every day. They can be 11 o'clock. They can be 2 a.m. in the morning. But for various clients. But so I still have the pressure of deadline, but the writing I'm doing now, it could be anything from remarks for, a CEO level person to a press release to a statement that's going to go to a newspaper. I used to write for a newspaper, but now I write statements on behalf of organizations to be sent to newspapers. So I actually think now that I'm writing a lot of the diversity of my writing, the diversity of tone, is a broader spectrum than when I was a journalist.
What was the most, and this is one of these rapid fire ones. What was one of the, or what was the most challenging or painful story you've ever covered?
Wow, they're quite a few, but I mean, one of the things when I in the early when you're a rookie reporter, one of the things that you have to cover a lot, like you work weekend. Typically, you work a weekend day. Either you work a Saturday or you work a Sunday. Like when you start out,
right?
And I covered a lot of car accidents, murders, and some of the saddest stories are young people, like teenagers, who die 3 at a time in a car accident because someone lost control of a car. Those are some of the saddest stories that I've had to cover. But then I covered, large scale tragedy. I covered 9/11 for Newsday. I was, on the scene at 9/11. I saw what the World Trade Center site looked like after the towers fell. It was, a big smoldering pile of rubble. I mean, it was dramatic. I mean, I never saw anything like it. Because if you remember, there were a lot of financial institutions in the World Trade Center towers. So there was a lot of paper, right? The force of the blast, and these are some of the things I remember. The force of the blast pushed all of this paper to the point that there were buildings near the World Trade Center that the fire escapes were filled with paper, because the paper was pushed with such force that it became trapped in the fire in the spaces.
Wow.
In the fire escape. This is I'm talking in the hours after the tragedy. These are the things I saw. So one of the things about journalism that I think is very special is that it puts you in places that you would just never be if without pen and paper or a TV camera and a microphone.
Right.
It took me various parts of the country. I mean, I covered Rosa Parks' funeral. I rode in limousines with rappers. I've met President Obama. You know what I mean? These are things that, had I not been a journalist, I wouldn't have been able to do. And it's a real special profession.
If you were sworn in as head of state of any country, let's take Guyana, for example. What are the first 3 things you would want to do?
I think, which is what I talked about a little earlier, it's always important to know your audience, but to know that, what your audience is feeling in a moment, in a time, right? So if I was sworn in as the head of state and in my campaign to the time of being swearing in, one of the things that I would be doing first I would be listening, right, to what people are feeling, what they're experiencing, right, and then second, I would be crafting a vision for policy to speak to what I'm hearing, and then third is I would be wanting to quickly execute against the most pressing things that people want addressed.
What are you most proud of?
What am I most proud of? I'm most proud of the arc of my story, of my own personal story. I don't think it's a remarkable story necessarily, but I'm proud of the arc of it.
Yes.
Like where I came from to where I am and what I've been able to do and where I've been able to be and what I've been able to see in those moments.
Who are some black leaders that you admire and respect?
I admire President Obama tremendously. What I like about his story, and I feel is very similar to my own story, is this idea of, being in a middle class environment and understanding that education opens a lot of doors, and then applying yourself, and then applying yourself to the point that you rise and apply yourself for some more and rise, and even in the face of setbacks, pushing through. He is someone I really admire in terms of the arc of his story. Single parent household, grandparents heavily involved, president of the United States.
That is remarkable.
Yeah,
that's very remarkable. What is the least appealing profession you'd want to take on?
Least appealing profession. This is probably the PR side of me. I don't like to criticize any profession.
Right,
I think you can always find, depending on who you are, you can find. I've seen people find joy in any profession. One of the things I think people tend to do that I don't necessarily like is they sort of deride or dismiss people who are in functions like the facilities guy at your company.
Gotcha.
Who makes sure that the place is well kept, or the garbage guys who come by and make sure that the garbage is. We tend to say those are jobs. I'd never do that, and for some of us that may very well be true. But I think sometimes we don't think holistically enough about where we all play in the overall functioning of society. Like, we're not at a point where robots are going to do some of these things, and we want them done, and we should value people who do them.
Yes.
And regardless of the motivation they have behind doing them, and regardless of the circumstance, I think we should honor people who do good work.
Agree.
Yeah.
I totally agree. What inspires you, Errol?
What inspires me? My parents inspire me a lot. Yeah.
What do you do to relax?
I actually cook a lot.
Yes.
A lot.
Yes. Next conversation, we're going to talk about some recipes.
That's poetry's my first hobby, and cooking is probably my second, and travel my third.
What's next for you?
I'm actually, for the first time in my life, I actually don't know. Up until this point in my life, I'd been, I knew when I got to a certain point in journalism that I was probably going to try my hand at government, and I knew when I got to a certain point in government, I was going to try my hand at agency work, public relations.
Right.
But I'm actually at a point where I'm so thoroughly enjoying my work that I'm not seeing the next chapter very clearly right now.
Maybe that's a good thing,
I
too.
think it is, yeah.
Yes. If you could go back in time, and what would you tell the 13-year-old Errol? What would you tell that boy?
I would actually have told myself to probably, I majored in English when I was in school. I would have probably majored in something like history. The fact of the matter is, for me, I already had the capacity for English. So it was like I did the thing that was easy, that I already knew how to do. But if I'd done another discipline, it would actually inform my work today.
All right, Sean, in the chat room, Sean P. asked, do you believe that power corrupts?
I think it can. I think it is extremely seductive as it relates to corruption. And I think one of the things, like for instance, when you look at the Middle East, we have a lot of hopes for the Middle East, right?
Right.
Like Egypt, we had a lot of hopes around Egypt and the Arab Spring, but as much as we hope, sometimes the new regimes don't always meet our hopes. Power is a fluid thing, but I think what's constant is people power. People power can always influence those who are corruptible. And I think people power it's that thing that can temper things. But it involves sacrifice, and it involves consistency and engagement, right? Because if you don't have people power, that corruption, that seduction of corruption that can happen, it can careen out of control. But if you have the consistency of engagement, it's a lot harder. And I think one of the things I admire about the American form of government, although it's imperfect and we have corruption, is that it has more checks and balances than in a lot of parts of the world. We have a media that can get access to information. We can look at budgets. We can look at the emails that politicians send. We can vet things and we can question. And what that does is it forces people to apply a certain kind of rigor to how they do their jobs.
And Sean P. also asked, have you seen difference in the candidate and the elected person?
I think what I've seen is that people are campaigning earlier. So it used to be that the presidential election happened, in the year before you went to the polls. Now it's happening. I mean, the presidential election has already started, and President Obama is barely through the first year of his second term.
Yes.
So what I see is, and I think media is a part of this, I think the internet is part of this, people are positioning themselves earlier. They're framing earlier. And I tend to think that's mostly bad. It's not good because the layman is getting exhausted, just fatigued by it all.
Yeah.
It's about people, parrying for position as opposed to a discussion about substance and where we need to go as a country.
What advice do you have for young people who want to get into or want to get a career in public relations?
Look, if you're gonna work in any sort of communications field, you've got to be really fluent in communications, right? So, like I said, I talk to a lot of young people. I read resumes. I give people guidance on what they need to do in terms of their narrative, and a resume is a big part of your narrative. I believe when it comes to messaging, you should try to tell a story, right? But just get it right. Things shouldn't have mistakes. They shouldn't have errors. You should have a command of the language. Show that you have a command through everything that you do, even down to the phone message you leave for someone.
That is very important.
Yeah, because people make snap judgments, right? I mean, one of the things that I think, like Malcolm Gladwell writes about this a lot, people frame their long-term impressions of you sometimes in an instant. So it could be you met someone at a cocktail party and you told a really, really witty joke. That might frame how someone thinks about you for a year, because people tend to go back to how you make them experience, right? So Maya Angelou has a great quote. She says that over time people forget what you did to them, but they never forget how you made them feel.
True. Very true.
Right? So when you communicate, I think I always communicate with the thought, I want to make people feel, so they remember me through laughter, through something provoking, something thoughtful, right? And that goes for every layer of my life.
Don in the chat room, Don asked, in an age where 2-year-olds are adept at using iPads, etc., before they can read, how would you advise the youth to read more? Just telling them to read more does not seem to work anymore.
Yeah, I think when we talk to young people, we shouldn't speak in remote terms. We should speak in practical terms that they're going to understand. I mean, I think young people understand they want to be an adult one day who's taking care of themselves, who's managing a home. And I think sometimes we say you need to do this, but we don't communicate on a practical level why. I mean, in terms of the, you know what I mean?
This
And I think reinforcing that is how you start to get through.
You mentioned that you love what you do so much, and as a result of that, or one of the reasons why you can't think of what you're going to do next. But what is most gratifying about your current job?
I think it's, one of the things I do know that I want to do is want to write a book. But I've been mulling with the ideas for a long time, and I've always thought that I didn't live enough to write a book. But now I feel like I've lived enough to really start thinking seriously about it, because I think experience informs depth in writing, especially book writing. But one of the things that what fulfills me about my job the most is that it's problem solving. At a basic level, it's people come to me in some of their most anxious moments, and my job is to bring that anxiety level down and to provide assurance that things are going to be managed well and contained. And helping people solve those problems is extremely gratifying.
Have you ever thought of yourself or considered yourself in that context as a healer?
More on the personal side than the professional.
Side.
But certainly friends, come to me for help in that regard. Yeah. I'm not raising Lazarus.
I have a question. Time is upon us, and I have this question I should have asked earlier, but I'm going to ask it now. You wrote about white power, skinhead attacks on blacks, which prompted the country's commission and on human relationship to study and address this trend. What inspired the story?
Yeah, that goes back to my time at the Los Angeles Times. There was a rash of violence by skinhead groups in northern Los Angeles County, which was a changing area in terms of demographic, where more people of color were moving into northern Los Angeles County because of lower cost housing, but they had longer commutes into LA. It's much like what's happening in a lot of cities today. But you also had at that time some skinhead groups that were operating in northern LA County, and there was a rash of violence against some people of color around the time. And I took a hard look at how these incidents were connected, and a look at who these skinhead groups are, which then prompted the LA Hate Crimes Commission to take a deeper look at the issue. It was something that hadn't been focused on, and I was able to knit these things together and able to bring some government focus to it.
Okay. Dawn said President Obama's legacy depends in large part on the Affordable Care Act. How would you manage his PR?
I think I've actually been pleased with what I've seen in just recent days, actually, and I think they brought in someone to fix the website. They got out there and they said, we messed up the website, it's fixed now. There were a lot of people saying, look, why should, they thought it was below the White House to have to say that a website is now operational and fixed. But there was so much talk about the dysfunction of the website that I actually thought it was a pretty bold PR move to kind of get out there, take your lumps, and then say, hey, it's fixed now. You know what, folks? Get on there and get your health care. But I think in terms of a longer-term strategy around the Affordable Care Act, they've got to start, and they've begun to do this, but I think it's got to be echoed more, and they've got to get a network of advocacy groups and allies to start doing it, is pumping out the positive stories about people who are enrolling and how it's changing their lives. And I think that's got to be a narrative that's continually pushed.
I'm going to go someplace. What with this question, what story your mother always tells about you?
What story?
Yeah.
I don't think she tells one in particular. You know, I think I think if anything, she kind of tells stories about like when I was a little kid and how responsible I was. Like I'm an oldest of three, and you know my kind of general disposition for being a disciplinarian even at a young age. you know, it's the burden of the oldest.
Yes. And last but not least, this question I ask everybody, so you don't escape.
Yeah.
What makes you laugh out loud?
What makes me laugh out loud? A website called The Onion.
The Onion, Errol. You visit this website often?
Periodically. But it's actually, satirically, it's like one of those things that it kind of speaks to my sense of humor, and it actually makes me laugh out loud.
You know, we spoke a lot about communications and language and different things.
Yeah.
Before Karen G just said it's a funny site. It's a funny site.
It's really good.
Yeah. First, I want to thank you for coming, Errol.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me.
Right, you're quite welcome. This was long overdue. But can I ask you one last thing to take us out with some words of advice or some words of inspiration for, especially for young people that might be listening tonight?
Yeah, I think, you know, I started the conversation by talking about communications and talking about communications and the importance of communications as a thread throughout your life, regardless of what you're doing professionally. And I definitely want to close on that note. I think oftentimes we think of communication as homework or something that's separate in our lives. You know, so it's like, here's this report I got to write, or this email I've got to send, or these resumes I've got to send out, right? So it's sort of something that's sequestered in our lives. It's off to the side, right? It's something you invoke. It's something you take down from the shelf. I think my message to folks is that it's got to be part of, it's like the blood running through your veins in terms of how you operate, because it's how we operate at every level of our lives. It's how we leave a legacy with people, whether it be a brief interaction or a long-term interaction. So, and I think if we start to think about oral and written communication in that way, it becomes less of this tedious thing. Like often people get scared, oh my goodness, I got to write this thing. You know, that's not where we want to be. We want to be empowered so that that's something we feel good about, we're ready to fire it off. You know, not something we necessarily want to have to call on a friend to write on our behalf, which is something, you know, in our community that we suffer from, right?
Yes.
You know, and I think if more people could get there, we could have more control over our story and our narrative for the future.
Control our story, control our narrative. And just a few more things in the chat room. Sean P said, excellent show, blessings. Thanks, Sean. And Dawn said, we live in language as a network of conversations. Thank you for a good discussion about communications.
Yeah, thank you.
And just thank you all for tuning in this evening. And I want to say it was a blessing to have Errol. It was an honor.
Great to be here.
Thank you. And so good night until next Tuesday.
Until next time.
Next time, right.